Welcome to Conversations with Matt DeLockery. In this series, I want to do something that is just about never done in church, but really should be. I want to talk about where our Bible actually comes from. After all, if people gather together to talk about this book and claim to base their lives on what it contains, shouldn't we know something about where it comes from? Specifically, in this series, I want to look at where the New Testament comes from. Partly because I'm a New Testament guy, but also because there isn't time to do both Testaments without this series getting really long. There are quite a lot of things that we have to cover to go from a Jewish man speaking in Palestine 2,000 years ago to you holding a book in your hand in a different language that talks about what that man said and did. It's a long journey, and we need to begin this journey with something that most people are aware of but probably haven't been told much about. We're going to talk about what happened before people started writing things down. You see, it's generally accepted among scholars that it took around 40 years before the first gospel was written down, though, like all dates related to the New Testament, that's debated. Many of the letters were written before that time, but it took about 40 years before the Gospels started to be physically written down, the stories about the man that we just talked about. That means that the primary stories about Jesus were communicated by word of mouth for a long time. So, can we trust them? Well, in our first two episodes, we're going to cover what happened before anything was written down at all, and it won't be until the fourth episode until we discuss the Gospels in any depth. But let's stop talking about what we're going to cover and start actually covering things. 2,000 years ago, a Jewish man lived and taught in Palestine for about 3 years. This is our starting point. It should come as no surprise that everything that we find in the New Testament is based on Jesus' life, even though all of it is not directly about his life. For example, the epistles, which is the Greek word for letters, really focus a lot on sorting out the problems in specific churches, thereby answering people's questions on how to follow the path that this Jesus figure laid out. The Gospels are presentations about Jesus' life, but before any of that happened, people had direct encounters with Jesus. After all, he was teaching for several years, so why don't we start there? And let's assume that we were some of those people who saw him some of the times he spoke and performed some of his miracles. Now what? You and I are listening to Jesus talk, and we have seen him heal some people. So what do we do? Well, if this happened today, we would probably post this on social media. Stuff about Jesus would regularly find its way into the trending topics, and we would expect to see #Jesus and #miracle to become common. And of course, we would expect to find a lot of OMGs for various reasons. If you think about it, though, things really wouldn't have been a lot different 2,000 years ago. Granted, people were living in a non-digital age. Everything was analog. But at its very core, our reaction now would have been pretty much the same reaction as anyone's back then. When something happens, people tell other people. And for the record, everyone would have been telling people. It's not like just the people who liked Jesus would have been going around telling people. Everyone was talking about him, whether they liked him or not. Now, this wasn't just happening in a single place on a single occasion. Jesus probably had about a 3-year ministry in which he was an itinerant preacher. In other words, he went from place to place, teaching people his thoughts, performing miracles, or what many people thought were miracles, and showing people what he meant by how he lived, like eating with sinners, which other religious leaders would not have done. So we can kind of think of him as being on the lecture circuit, though with some obvious differences. Something else we should note is that all of this took place in a somewhat confined area. Early Christianity spread very rapidly, but Jesus' ministry was fairly confined. The distance from Jerusalem, the southern end of where Jesus spent most of his time, to the Sea of Galilee, the northern end of where he spent most of his time, is about 70 miles. And most of what he did happened in a sort of broad path directly between those two places, rather than spreading out everywhere. It's like a really wide line that goes back and forth between Jerusalem and the Sea of Galilee. That's an oversimplification of things, but hopefully it'll help you to see that he spent his time going back and forth over the same areas again and again and again for several years. Now, when Jesus taught things, like any teacher on the lecture circuit, he repeated himself. YouTube hadn't been invented yet, so for someone to be able to see him speak, he would have to have been physically present. There were no podcasts, so for someone to hear his thoughts, he would have to repeat them. I, on the other hand, may never give this lecture again. I've done it once, it's recorded, what's the point? I'll just give people a link. Much easier. But Jesus would have had to repeat himself a lot, because he was living in a world that didn't have the same level of technology as ours does. And this brings up sort of an obvious problem. If there were no recordings, how would people keep track of information? How would they not just forget it? I guarantee that people in the ancient world were much more aware of this problem than you or I are. After all, if something was not written down, which it usually wasn't, and everyone collectively forgot it, it was gone. There was no getting it back. It was erased from history, and it could not be gotten back. That was a problem, and everyone knew it. But there were two things that helped make this not such a big deal. First, teachers spoke in ways that were easy to remember. Jesus did this, but this was not just a Jesus thing. All teachers in the ancient world, in all cultures, did this, because they had to. If you were a teacher and you wanted your students to remember a lesson, you were likely to get further if you put it in a form that was easy to remember. Think of all the stories that Jesus told. If you put something in the form of a story, it's much easier to remember. Also, if you spend some time studying what you find in the Gospels or other ancient writings, you will find that there's a great deal of structure to them. The Iliad and the Odyssey, non-biblical examples, show this as well. So this was not just a Jesus thing. Again, this was a whole ancient world sort of thing. Second, people had much better memories back then than we have now. This is not because people were wired any differently back then than we are. It's because they worked on the memories. And if you lived in a culture in which most people, including yourself, were illiterate, then you might work on your memory too. Back to the Iliad and the Odyssey. It was common for storytellers to memorize the entirety of both of them. You're looking about 27 to 28,000 lines of text if it were written down. However, people who had only memorized these two works would have been looked down on because they hadn't produced anything of their own. It was basically considered child's play. Let me give you another example of the memories that people had in the ancient world. A few years ago, I heard a presentation by a New Testament scholar named Craig Keener, and he was telling us about the memories of people in the ancient world. He told us about a man who got up and was delivering an oration, basically a speech, that he wrote himself and was giving it to an audience. Then, when he was done, a man from the audience got up and yelled out, "Hey, that's my creation, you stole it." Then he proceeded to deliver the whole thing himself. Now, the man up front was obviously stunned and at a loss because he knew for a fact that he had written it. Then the guy in the audience laughed and said, "Nah, I'm just messing with you. I just wanted to show you how good my memory was." Now, I might be messing up that story a little bit because I heard it years ago and my memory is okay, but I'm not good enough to remember a story on the fly well enough to convince an audience who just heard the original that it was the same thing. When we're talking about people who lived in a world that was based on the spoken word and had always been based on the spoken word, we're not dealing with the same world that we live in now. Things were different. So how did people communicate information in the ancient world? Across cultures, so not just a Jesus thing here, there were three main ways of communication. First, you had the informal and uncontrolled method. This is basically standard communication, and we do this all the time. This is just talking with people, and it represents the bulk of the communication, and there were few to no checks or balances on the accuracy of the information communicated. So nothing special here. Second, you had the formal and controlled method. This is the sort of thing you would find in the passing on of official oral tradition. Sometimes there was a designated teacher and student, as in the rabbi-disciple relationship. But other times, there would be the passing on of information such as when Paul or someone delivered oral tradition to a church, as a means of saying, this is official teaching about Jesus, or some other point. We're going to talk more about this in the next episode. Finally, and most importantly for today, is the informal and controlled method. This is something we have no parallel for in a culture in which most people can read. In this method of communication, there was no set teacher or student, and there was no formal tradition. However, we're talking about information that is worth remembering and isn't stuff one just wants to throw away. This isn't something we really think about in cultures like the modern West, since just about everybody can read. Once something is written down, we can always go back and look at it. In an oral culture, that wasn't true. If no one remembered it, it was gone. So if you wanted to remember something, you had to remember it. As such, people took care to remember things that were important. Sitting around with people in your community and telling stories was a regular occurrence. However, in this case, we're not talking about news stories. We're talking about the same old stories again and again. And it was not like the same person told the story every time. If it was a popular story that lots of people liked, it might have been shared with a group by an individual, then other people would try sharing the story as well. So maybe you heard Jesus preach, but I couldn't go. Then you come back and tell the group what you heard. After a few times of telling us about it, maybe I would take a shot at telling the story. Next time, maybe somebody else tries telling it. Keep in mind, though, that the original storyteller would often still be there. So we're not talking about people wandering all over the place and telling stories as they went. We're talking about small communities of people who did not move around much. People were often born, lived, and died in the same small area around the same people. This was a telling and retelling of stories to the same people again and again, and other people were practicing it so that they could remember the stories, so that the memory would continue. The end result was the creation of a sort of community memory that would outlast an individual's memory. As you might guess, you would find some variances in the versions of the stories as different people told them. Each person might tell the story a little differently, but that was okay. Precise details were not expected in this form of communication, as they would be with a formal and controlled method. Consequently, if you, as a teacher, were intending to give information to people that they would communicate by sharing stories again and again as a group, you would make sure to do it in such a way that the main points were hard to miss. In other words, you, as a teacher, knew that people would be a little fuzzy on the details, so you wouldn't make the main point of what you were telling them dependent on those details. You would paint in broad strokes. Make sense? So now that you have a better idea of how oral cultures dealt with information communicated by word of mouth, I want to address an objection. Lots of people say that communicating things by word of mouth is a lot like the children's game telephone. Most of us played the game when we were kids, but for those of you who are not familiar, it goes like this. You get a line of kids together, and the first kid comes up with a message. Then kid 1 whispers the message into kid 2's ear so that no one hears it. Then kid 2 does the same to kid 3, and so on down the line until the last kid. Then the last kid says what he heard, and the first kid says what he actually said to begin with, and everybody laughs because the two are different. Ha ha ha, it's a funny game. From what we've talked about today, I think you can start to see that this is not the same sort of thing. There are a lot of differences between the game telephone and the informal and controlled method of transmission that we've been talking about. Let me list a few. 1. The game telephone is a game. It's no fun unless a message changes. If the kids transmitted the message perfectly every time, they wouldn't play very long because it would be boring. The whole point is to change the message. 2. This assumes that information about Jesus and what he was doing was on the level of gossip. However, people were talking about Jesus like he was a potential prophet or Messiah. To Jews in the first century waiting on someone to free them from the rule of the Romans, this was serious business. 3. It misunderstands how people would have thought about information about a potential Messiah and places it in the wrong category. It thinks that this is informal and uncontrolled, when in fact it is informal and controlled. We modern Westerners don't readily understand this because we don't have this method of communication. We don't have the same sort of community telling and retelling of stories because we live in a literary society rather than an oral one. We simply don't have this category for the communication of information like every other person in the ancient world did. 4. It underestimates how good the ancient memory was for individuals and completely neglects to consider how good the community memory was. We already talked about both of these. 5. It assumes that each person tells another person in private, like Kid 1 whispering in Kid 2's ear. Instead, this would have been done primarily in small communities with the same people over and over again, and the telling and retelling would have been done in public. Furthermore, the original teller of the story would probably have been present for many of the retellings and could easily correct things if they wandered too far from the truth. Now, there are other reasons besides these, but you get the point. What I want to communicate to you is that telling stories, i.e. communicating information, in an oral culture was nothing like it is today. Teachers put things in easy-to-remember formats. People tried to remember things, and were fairly good at it, because if you forgot something, you lost it. The retelling of stories reinforced individual memories so that there became a legitimate community memory. And this would produce a body of material about Jesus that would be really hard to destroy. There would be some variances in the details of the stories, absolutely, but you could not wipe out the core message, or really, even the main points. There are too many people actively involved in trying to remember it, compared to our passively remembering things today, to wipe out the message. It just was not possible. Hopefully, all of this has given you a better idea of what it would have been like for information about Jesus to have been passed around. It would have been nothing like the free-for-all that many people today seem to think it was. Now that we know that reliable information about what Jesus said and did would be communicated and kept by individuals and communities, we can move on to the next step in the process. I mentioned earlier that there was a method of communication called the formal and controlled method. In the next episode, we're going to take a look at the role that formal oral tradition played in passing along information about Jesus. So if you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you can keep up with the rest of the story. And if you've been enjoying this podcast, please consider sharing it with a friend. Until next time.